coming to our session. I'm Sherene James-Williamson, and this is Jorjan Dolphy, and we're both from the University of the West Indies. And we're going to try to, within the context even of the new definition of museums, we're going to try to do a play on that and natural heritage. We tend to bring natural heritage and natural heritage ideas to a space where it is not, it's not always being talked about when we come to MAC and similar conferences in the region. So I hope that we can whet your appetite and we can engage you in some of the work that we're doing, because you will see in the end that it is participatory. So this presentation is in 3 parts. The first part is where I'm going to give you some definitions. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the significance and the framework. Then I'm going to pass on to Jorjan, who will go through with you some opportunities by way of examples and illustrations of geosites as repositories. Educational, she'll talk to you about the educational, aesthetic and tourism, conservation and resilience value of such spaces. And then I will come back in now with the Caribbean sort of scenario. It says challenges there, not because it's a barrier, but it is because it is the reason we're not able to achieve the geoparks within the region. And I'll try to identify some steps that we can take together to be able to realize geoparks in the region. So if you want to make it into a puzzle, we have all the pieces and I'm going to start putting them in place for you. So we're going to define geosites, geopark, UNESCO Global Geoparks, so you can appreciate the difference, and Geo Heritage, so you can sort of see all the puzzle pieces before we start connecting them. So a geosite, first of all, is a site of geological interest. So as it says, geo, it is a site, terra firma, it's about Earth. It has been defined by IUGS as a site with key geological elements. And these geological elements contribute to scientific tradition. So the research and all the educational aspects that go into or come out of these sites. Then we have, for example, our colleagues in Italy, they have described it as anything geological, geomorphological, anything that has to do with earth and the landscape as a geosite. And then we go on to our colleague Prosser and his colleagues who talk about geosites and geological sites and geomorphological sites are recognized through an audit, through an assessment and selection process. So it gives us the idea of, you see something, it belongs to terra firma, we have to identify it, we have to categorize it, we have to list it. So if we bear those ideas in mind, I think you will enjoy the journey. So a geopark, for example, is a protected area, and this protected area can be protected because of its international significance. So we are thinking, for example, in Bahamas, where we have, it has been studied, the coral reefs have been studied to give you an idea of geological climate change. And we have been able to mark those horizons all the way into Barbados and into Jamaica, into Bermuda, and across into parts of Florida. If we can think of sites that are connected internationally, we already start to think about a geosite. So you already start to put in place some of the ideas in your own space. It is important for tourism, for example, or can be extended into tourism, sustainable development, conservation, education, and of course the research. But it is primarily based on geology. So when we get to the geopark, we're expanding it from just looking at the science and starting to apply it into other things. So this is a picture of Vinales in Cuba, which might very well, if all the things pan out, might very well be our first regional geopark, right? A UNESCO Global Geopark now is part of the UNESCO Global Geopark framework. Now this has I have it highlighted here, a holistic concept of protection. So it engages the community. So it's not just the scientists, it's not just because tourists want to see it, it's not just because you can bring children to tour it, but it takes into account empowerment of your local community. So there's economic development, there is conservation processes, and it is all linked to the earth. But it is not because, it is because of geology why you have it, but it is not because of geology why it thrives. okay? And I have a little note here that there are 177 UNESCO Global Geoparks in the world from 46 territories. There is 0 from small island developing states to date, which means there's 0 in the Caribbean, all right? Just in case we're not making the connection. And within the context of Geo Heritage now, we extend this idea. So we are plugging in the people. In fact, when you talk about the geoparks, you can't really talk about it without plugging in Geo Heritage, right? Now, let us look at some of our buildings. The Museum of Parliament in Barbados is made from limestone, local limestone that's around. When you look at a space like that, you can see your limestone, you can see your buildings, people use the buildings, right? The mortar that is used to connect all these blocks are lime mortar. The gravestones that probably came from Europe back in the day when people were settlers here and got buried, a lot of this have provenance, and a lot of this information forms part and parcel of our geoheritage. So how people interact with it, to bring it to a sort of an arena that people don't really make connections with. You have quarries that existed to build homes during colonial time. Who were the people digging the rocks and breaking them? We have a folk song in Jamaica, Good on Emmanuel Road, Girl and Boy Figure Broke Rock Stone. Yes, this was a work song from quarries, right? And so you have to imagine, if you wanted to make connections with terra firma, you could look at your ancestors and who used to work, who you hear didn't have a thumb because it got knocked off by a stone. And so you can connect people to the rocks. And once you are able to do that and have people see themselves, not necessarily in the rocks, but in the process, we're looking at geoheritage. So I hope that's kind of clear. So within that context, we're looking at science, research, and education. We put on top of that the cultural aspects, the tangible and intangible heritage, and then we put sort of the icing on top of that is the aesthetics, the tourism. So we are not just selling the sun, sand, and sea, but we're selling where the sand actually comes from. What are the characteristics of that beach that makes it so relevant, and how does the land speak to the sea, and how your visitors speak to all of that. So to sort of put it into perspective, your geoheritage, your geosites, your geoparks, and geoconservation are part of a strong interdisciplinary movement. So it's like a system of moving parts that combine science, economy, and tourism, and societal participation. I hope you see in the museum and the repository idea, right? So I'm bringing the puzzle together, right? So looking at a parallel now, we have our use or our value, and we have education, tourism, conservation, and advocacy. We have disaster heritage, memorializing, and resilience. And I have advocacy there because conservation projects are in themselves advocacy type programs. It's just that we're dealing with the natural environment. And when you look at geosites and geoparks, and you look at museums and the role and function of these spaces, you check all the boxes. So it's very instructional to sort of pull from this, that your outdoor space, and I remember yesterday Shani said something, and when she said it, the bells went off, the light bulbs went on. She said that in the focus groups for Latin America and the Caribbean, people spoke about spaces and not a building. And I said, okay, my presentation is done. Because it is a space that provides you with information, and it leads you through stories depending on how it's curated, which is exactly what we do in our museum spaces. So indoors like the outdoors, the sites are both repositories as well as they create the repository, because we're collecting the fossils, we're collecting the rocks, we're collecting the biodiversity that exists, because we have, in the Caribbean we have high endemism, and we have high endemism because our rocks are particularly unique, right? And it is because of the substrate why we have what is above it. So we have this high biodiversity. And so when we start to collect these items and we start to store them, we're building a repository that can then be used inside a museum. But at the same time, you can go to the natural environment and see these things in their natural habitat, right? The sites lend themselves to being curated as any exhibition space. If you've been to a botanical gardens, for example, you see all these labels and you see signs, and sometimes if you go through a tea garden, it tells you, high tea kind of things and what mixes with what and what does what, and all the blooms that give you the fragrances, and all of this information is useful because you can curate the space, you can have a trail. For example, we're looking at creating a seismic heritage tour or seismic heritage trail in Kingston and Port Royal. So you can walk along the street, see the buildings that have been modified. And on top of the buildings that have been modified, the spaces where buildings were that were not rebuilt, right? And that adds to the narrative, and we hope that that narrative will add to resilience and build more awareness for people. And as such, we think that geosites and geospaces and geoparks should really receive the same kind of elevation and protection as we do our museums, because they are, in fact, repositories. And so it could be a central argument for our conservation programs. So that brings us to part 2. Notice you're all coming together and putting the puzzle together with us.
Okay, so good morning again, everybody. I'm Jorjan. I'll be basically presenting a few examples of geoparks around the world, how they present opportunities to foster education and awareness, sustainable tourism, and or even just building community resilience. So, as mentioned, I'll be looking into illustrations of different geoparks across Japan, Ireland in the UK, Brazil, and they do serve as facilitators of outreach since they are repositories of Earth heritage. So we gain a sense of awareness of our geologic landscape and how they interact with people and culture and history, and sometimes they serve as vectors of memory. So that warrants conservation and protection. And hopefully through this discussion, you guys will start to appreciate maybe in your own territories areas that can serve as geoparks. So I'll be looking into Cuba, St. Lucia, and Trinidad. So this is the Izu Peninsula Geopark of Japan. And so as you can see in the right images, guided tours, even people doing sea kayaking, viewing different structures and features. So this is basically a more interesting or different way of viewing different structures and so forth, learning about the volcanic landscape of the area. In the bottom left, you can see Cape Sumek, which is an outcrop of different basalts, columnar basalts, which have these particular patterns and forms. Are very interesting to look at. And in the top left is the Shimoda Historical Streetscape. So this actually forms part of their built heritage. So some of the rocks and material actually came from this park. So in a sense, that further connects them to the environment, further creates a sense of place. In their pavements, their building structures, their gravestones, they're further tied to that area. And even though volcanic landscapes, earthquakes, tsunamis, they're a source of destruction, damage, and maybe can evoke a lot of feeling for some people, that they present an opportunity for resilience and teaching, making people more aware of these dangers, the landscape, and how to prepare for them and to mitigate against certain disasters. And also in this landscape, there are narratives attached to it. So previous populations actually attributed, volcanic activity, earthquakes to, deities, which is not unique to Japan. We can see a lot of examples from across the world of those religious or spiritual attachments to landscape and natural disasters. So again, on the topic of disaster resilience and disaster heritage, they have these structures called Tsunami He, which are these inscriptions that bear tales of past disasters, specifically tsunamis. So this one actually reads, "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point." So their positioning is actually very strategic. So where they're positioned, it actually serves as a point to say, this, you cannot build or should not build below this point. Because in the past, tsunami waters may have breached certain areas and so forth. So even some tsunami heat, these stone inscriptions, they will detail the number of lives lost, the number of homes lost, buildings, even how high the tsunami was. So unfortunately, in some of these areas of Japan, they're not being taken care of, they're disintegrating, vegetation is encroaching on some of these structures, which is unfortunate because they do serve as not only aspects of heritage, but helps people to be resilient. And in the case of the 2011 earthquake, people actually looked to these structures when the early warning tsunami system failed. So taking you into Ireland and the UK, this is actually a transnational geopark, the Marble Arch Caves. So this captures an almost 900 million year history, as well as recent history of the area. So you can see people touring the caves, and the recent history captured have a variety of forts, as you can see, castles, churches, and there are also information centers within the geopark. So people can come to these spaces and gain further insight or information about the space that they're interacting with. So you can see that rock here that probably would provide a history of the landscape, how certain features came to be, and so forth. Now into Brazil, the Cerrado Geopark, which actually covers the last 600 million years of Earth's history. So in this geopark, you have probably over 100,000 inhabitants, including indigenous populations. This is in the top left, the Quilombos. They can be regarded as Brazilian Maroons, because at the time they had escaped the plantations and sought refuge in these areas. So these populations carry on the history, the traditions, the practices of their ancestors. And also you find drawings, petroglyphs in certain areas of the park. So back to what Sherene said, you're getting an image of how people through time have interacted with their landscape, how they've used certain tools maybe to create art or maybe food in some cases. In the bottom left, these are actually mineralizations of something called scheelite, which is a major ore of tungsten. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with tungsten. It's used in jewelry, used for drills. It's a very sturdy, tough substance, so it's very useful in that regard. So just to kind of take you into some probable Caribbean examples or possible sites that could serve as geoparks across the Caribbean, since, as previously mentioned, we don't have any geoparks within the Caribbean or SIDS as a whole. But Cuba, through Viñales, I would say Cuba is probably at the forefront with regards to geoheritage discussions, geodiversity discussions. Since the 50s, they've been discussing protecting geological spaces. So Viñales actually provides a great substrate for the beginning of this discussion in Cuba. They've actually submitted paperwork for it to be considered a geopark. So hopefully, that works out. So they have these distinctive limestone karst features across the landscape, these mounds. There are certain agricultural practices that have been passed down for generations, are practiced within the valley. Also, there's an image shown earlier of a mural, which was a depiction of human history, different ethnic groups, a dinosaur, I think. There's a snail in there. So it captures basically the evolution of life and how people have persisted throughout this environment. And the famous pitons of St. Lucia, the PMA. So it has a very distinctive shape, silhouette, the two very pointy mountains, volcanic structures. So this is a volcanic landscape. So we find a lot of sulfur springs, fumaroles, hot springs, and so forth. And this is a World Heritage Site. So there is actually a conservation strategy that is in place that could form as like a base or a foundation for a geopark. So, and as well as vinales. So there is a foundation in other territories as well for geoparks to kind of operate upon. But it would be great if there would be the incorporation of geologic elements or specific measures targeted towards safeguarding or acknowledging geologic elements and how these elements basically interact with us or how we formed identity in some of these elements. And this is the La Brea Pitch Lake of Trinidad. I had the opportunity of going here myself. This is, if not, one of the largest commercial deposits of asphalt in the world. So as most of you, I'm sure, Okay, great. So as most of you guys are aware, oil and gas is a very big commodity in Trinidad. So essentially, you could say it forms part of their heritage. So this landscape, people actually swim in some of these little lakes and little rivers in the area. People believe it to have healing properties because of the sulfur. They believe it to be therapeutic. So people interact with this landscape in more of touristic aspect, but it has history in that indigenous populations believe the lake to be derived from a tragedy, so to speak. The story goes along the lines of a winged hummingbird god was punishing a group of villagers because they had consumed the sacred hummingbird. So to punish them, he had opened up the earth and created this lake of pitch, essentially this dark, thick material, and just basically swallowed up the whole village. So these are kind of the stories and narratives attached to certain places. And I think that with geoparks, we can further bring out some of these stories and narratives and sources of identity in some of these places. So obviously these are opportunities, but with these opportunities, you have challenges because we are in the Caribbean, we are very small islands. So Sherene is going to take you into some of the challenges that we might face here in the Caribbean and by extension, small island developing states.
Thanks, Jorjan. So in 2021, we had So even though the pieces were coming together, we have gaps, right? And we're going to talk about some of those gaps very quickly. So in 2021, we had a UNESCO commissioned project, a survey of small island developing states. And we sent out a survey to anybody we knew in small island developing states globally. And this is the Caribbean pullout of that. So geoparks in small island developing states, sure, we have parks. They're not designated geoparks, and they're by no means UNESCO Global Geoparks, right? Now, what are the features of our small island developing states that allow them to be interesting, necessary, important for geoparks? We have a high level of geodiversity, the rocks, the minerals, the fossils. And on top of that, we have a high level of biodiversity, which I had mentioned before. The substrate breeds very interesting life, right? We have diverse geodynamic settings, the Eastern Caribbean, packed full of volcanic activity. Then we have the Greater Antilles that used to be packed full of volcanic activity. So we have the remnants of all of that. We have the remnants of a big basalt floating basically on top of the mantle and interacting in the Eastern Caribbean. So we are looking at a lot of earthquake activity from faulting. We are looking at places in Trinidad, for example, that have folded and have metamorphic rocks. Places like Turks and Caicos have Jurassic rocks. You know about Jurassic Park, right? So we're in the right wheelhouse. There are no dinosaurs, but there are rudists, which are still big and rude, and rude meaning they're rough on the outside. We have global environmental significance. There are deposits in Jamaica, deposits in Trinidad, Barbados, that connect to other parts of the world. A lot of Trinidad and Trinidad sediments are linked back to outwash from the Orinoco River, from the Delta. So we're looking at a space or a place that if you took one end and went across to the other end, the diversity and similarities are significant, right? And then our geodiversity is linked to our history. Our churches are built from the rocks, right? A lot of our schools and other things. Even today, you need aggregate, you're gonna dig down some things from a quarry. So we have to imagine that even as we are building heritage today, because today's heritage is, what we're doing today, what we're doing is somebody else's heritage in the future. And so it is linked to our history, and our history is common. So we're doing the same things in the same sort of a ways. Even our systems of government and our lack of funding in our museums are about the same. So if we started to check off the boxes, we realize how similar we are, right? And so these are some of the features that make it interesting and right. On top of that, just this little illustration here, it shows you a small island developing state. And yes, we know that not all our small islands, not all of our states are islands, okay? So Belize, we know that you are not an island, but you are considered within the context. And so these islands they're growing out from the deep sea. They have shallow wave platforms. There's coastal sort of activity, communication, habitation. People live there. Tourists come for it, right? We have volcanic features like Jorjan just described. We have lakes and rocks and, a pitch of tar that swallowed up a village. And of course, the biosphere is what we live on, the fish, the mangroves, the trees, the fruits, And the icing on all of that is us, the people who live and thrive on our islands. It is because we are there why the resources are necessary. It is because we are there why we have buildings, because if we weren't there, what would we be using? And then you might think, oh yeah, but we're modern. What about our ancestry? They were using chert for cutting, right? They were using the clays for making pots, right? So they were using coves and mangrove areas to dock their boats and tend to their fish before they go up into the higher lands for where they inhabit. So this is what makes us necessary within this process. And so I'm not expecting to go through all of these on here, but these are aspects of the UNESCO Global Geopark, right? When you look at our small island developing states and you sort of scan through all of these features that we have listed here coming off of this little diagram, you realize that we have all of this. Sometimes we have groups of islands that have all of this. Sometimes we have individual islands that have all of this. But it is not because of a paucity of material why we don't have a UNESCO Geopark or any geopark listed. And so when we did our survey, we found that in terms of our respondents, these were some of the areas that people suggested had geoparks. Saba was suggested to have 6, right? Haiti and Jamaica, 15 and 16 respectively. Now, a lot of these, if you started to look at them, you can begin to rank, you can begin to look at the characteristics, right? So this is the making of a Caribbean type of an inventory, because this is what you need. In the previous talk, we were discussing collections, and this essentially is your collection, all that is embodied in each of our islands. I want to see the day when we have visitors who come to the region to sort of island hop like I did before, but just to see sites and to connect. Not only with, so we're not only connecting with the heritage that is people, but the heritage that is terra firma, yeah? So these are just some of the sites that we spoke about, and I'm not gonna go through them. I just wanted you to see how much information was collected and how inexhaustive this list is. And then I have this one in yellow because this one was designated in Spain in October as one of the first 100 geological sites by IUGS. It's not one of the first in terms of rank, like we rank 30 or 35, or it's just the first 100 because they're going to do a second 100, and they're gonna do that until we gain recognition and traction for the importance of terra firma within our sphere, right? So there's no established UNESCO Global Geopark in SIDS. Yes, as we said, it includes the Caribbean. Most Caribbean countries have national parks. Hardly any of them are based on geology, even though they have significant geological features. Jorjan just mentioned the pitons, right? So they're not based on geoheritage, they're not based on geodiversity. In fact, even the Blue Mountains, the designation, though it mentions the underlying geology, it is not the basis, but rather maroonage and other cultural aspects that allowed it, and biodiversity that allowed it to be inscribed as a World Heritage Site, despite the significant geology that is there. So I think what it is that probably people just can't bother with the geology, so they don't dive into it. I'm gonna say that. Sites are usually inscribed as Ramsar sites, World Heritage sites, but not UNESCO Global Geoparks. Now, some people are afraid of UNESCO Global Geoparks because of the process, but the process really starts on a national level, and it does work, and I'll show you in a minute. The appropriate connection, I believe, of the value of geology, and I think Jorjan alluded to that in a lot of what she was talking about. The geology, the geodiversity, the geological heritage, the conservation, environmental protection, and on the other side of that, the economic growth and economic development, the nature tourism, and the resilience have not been significantly connected. They've not really made that connection between the two sides of that coin, right? And so one of the challenges, or several of the challenges that we have within this context of having geoparks, whether they are global geoparks or national geoparks, is buy-in, which is the same issue we have with any of our projects, any of our museums, any of our advocacy sort of arrangements. So you're seeing the puzzle pieces, right? You're seeing it and you see the connection. So we need buy-in. But where does this buy-in come from? It comes from your local community. It has to start from the community, and the community then, and I think Terry made mention of something about a pottery museum in Japan yesterday. And it is because of the voice of the community that you lift it up to where it needs to go. The connection, so of course the UNESCO checklist, some people think it's so exhaustive, it's so much. But what people don't realize when you look at the checklist is that all the things on the checklist are the things you'd have to do if you wanted to just have a national geopark. The only difference between your national geopark and the UNESCO Global Geopark is that you put in a submission for it to happen, and you have to exist with all the parameters of a geopark for 2 years. But if you follow a trajectory of making something like this available to your population, your local community, then you've checked almost all the boxes. The last box is just to get UNESCO to say, yeah, you're UNESCO Global Geopark. And last but not least, there isn't a balance between the science and the geoconservation and the geoheritage. So like Jorjan and I, we talk a lot about the other side. And then we have those of our colleagues who just talk about the science. It's about the rocks, it's about the fossils. Some people can't even remember the fossil name after you've spoken to them for an hour, no matter how many times you pronounce it, right? But somebody will remember their connection to the land. Somebody will remember the story about the pitch lake, yeah? But you won't necessarily remember some fossil that I might show you and tell you the name of. And I think that is one of the things that we're missing. We spend a lot of time on the science, but we're not doing citizen science. We're not engaging the community to talk to us about their ideas of the science so that we can now intersperse the real, some of the additional, I don't want to say the real information, some of the additional information into what they already know. So the road to a geopark status, and I didn't put UNESCO Global Geopark, because what we're after now is for us to just start identifying our spaces and putting them into perspective. So the first thing is that you need to create a national commission, some kind of committee that will assist you in pulling all of this together. Because if you don't have an interdisciplinary committee to work on and work out and work through the processes, it's just going to sit there and it will just languish and you'll be no further ahead. An inventory of sites need to be documented. We need to start with a list. What do we know? What is here? Because that's like building up a collection, right? You start to, as Shani said earlier, you put out a call. So you have scientists, you bring them all in a room and you say, listen, we're looking for sites with these characteristics. You have any? Right? And you start to put them together, you start to document them, you start to put together the characteristics of these sites, and then you can categorize them, whether they're educational and scientific value. You want to put them within the context of maybe geoheritage, you want to put touristic and aesthetic value, and you start to organize and rank them. So within each category, you start to rank. And from that ranking, you now start to designate for protection. So you now start to indicate which ones would be a national representation, which ones would be regional or local documentation, what is important in this town, in this city, in this space. But you cannot do this in isolation. It must be done with the community. So the community that this thing lives and breathes in need to be involved in the conversation. You now need to develop the educational tools to allow for not only that local community, but the rest of the nation if you're going to make it into a national geopark. You want people to come there. You want people to identify with it. You want people to see themselves in it. Jorjan mentioned a while ago that some of what we do is entrenched in identity making. And so you have to make those connections. And of course, you have to build up economic activity to allow it to flourish. Right? And it is the economic activity and the building up of the local community that allows it to transition from just your regular national geopark to now becoming in the realm of a UNESCO Global Geopark. So that's when you now put in your applications and do like Cuba is doing. But if you want to follow something, the Cuban example is the best one to follow in terms of preparing. They have like 500 sites, but they have categorized, so out of the 500, they have 100 national sites, and they have, I think, 3 or 4 that they plan on designating or getting designation for UNESCO Global Geopark. So that brings me to what our project is. So all of this is part of a larger project that we're working on. And it's the UNESCO International Geoscience Program. So what we're trying to do is bring geoheritage to life. We're trying to make sure that we are making the project regional and we're connecting with our colleagues everywhere. so that we can begin to create these trails, make these inventories, and organize ourselves towards making this geopark. And we're starting off with virtual type things, so images, webinars, conversations, so that we can all begin to be on the same page with the same level of information to begin to elevate from just some rocks you kick on the street or build your house with to something that is tangible and useful. So I extracted this, and it wasn't last night. We extracted this, was Wednesday. We extracted this Wednesday morning from the document written with Sherene and the other colleagues from the Museum Defined for Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've played with it a little bit. So within the context of our geopark, museum is a tool, an ideal and unique platform to promote reflective, critical thinking. Our geoparks do that. It has culture and historical narratives and collections, and it has legacy, because we have the scientific tradition, the people who are researching the material, who have researched the material. A museum is a platform for the truth, an organism called to protect, rescue, preserve, exhibit, and study cultural assets. Think of medicinal plants. Those are cultural aspects. When those are gone, when they're destroyed, almost done, Shannon, literally on my last slide. When those are destroyed, we're destroying a lot more than you think. When we don't have people, older people in our communities that can tell you about some bush that they can boil, even if you never ever boil that bush, every time you see that bush, you remember your grandmother said, when you have a stomachache, you could use it. And so we have to think about these kinds of things. You know, we don't even have a seed bank or tissue bank that preserves some of this material. And so we want to express that we want to explore the past and identity for both tangible and intangible heritage that affect and encourage resilience and sustainability. So this is the essence of what we wanted to talk about today. And so in acknowledgement, we want to acknowledge you for funding some of this. And we want to acknowledge IGCP for funding Jorjan's travel. And we want to acknowledge my colleague, Professor Van Wyk de Vries. His input and his collaboration with our project has been tremendous. Thanks for your attention. Wow. Yes, Kay.
Is there a size limitation for the geoparks when you're thinking about?
Kay,
is there a size limitation for the geoparks? Is there a size limitation for the geoparks when you're thinking about delimiting their boundaries with a view to making them official, shall we say?
We have not seen anywhere there's a size limitation.
So they can be very small?
They can be small. Because you might have let's say you have a small tar pit, but you have an entire you have a museum probably next to it, or a research station, or a interpretive center or something. You have flyers and pamphlets, you probably have tours because there are other things neighboring that relate and are important. So there are ways of getting your site to do what it ought to do, which is educate and immerse. Not the tar pit, no immersion.
So I guess I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
First, how entangled do these potential sites have to be with the tourism project to be considered a geopark or a geosite? And then second, once you have that designation, what does that mean for like locals, say like Bahamians who extract from this site to do their own thing? Because I'm thinking about like in Athens we have salt ponds that I don't think most people even know about. The people historically extracted from that, and now mostly locals too. So I feel like the fossils, etc. And then I also like the pine forest and alcohol, which I think is not protected, so you can't reach those down anymore. So like, what does that mean now if we were to make the salt ponds a park? A site, can we still extract from that? Or?
Right. So the extraction of the salt is part of the process in that particular location. It doesn't stop extracting salt, in the sense that this is part of your economic activity. And I think that's why a lot of people don't coalesce around geoparks, simply because they think it's going to be like Ramsar or World Heritage, where you are restricted from doing things. So if part of your activity, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say if part of your activity relates to mining, for argument's sake, and you are actively mining, but you also have maybe fossils fall out, I don't know, and small children, adults, whoever, you have a tour where you give them a little bucket and they can collect 1 item or 10 items or 2 items, and they can describe and interpret and glue it onto a card or something for a small fee. You're still showing them the mining process that leads back to the rocks that they get at home or what goes into the pavement on the road. It's supposed to be you're conserving, yes, but you're not stopping the activity that is derived from that particular site. So as long as you don't have a program to completely level an entire hillside, if you understand what I mean. But it's an active breathing thing. And in terms of the tourism aspect, it is not touristic. It extends to the tourists, but it belongs to the community. The community develops what they're doing as the economic activity around the park, and they can invite others in to add to the economic value of the space. But it is community-owned, community-run. It belongs to the community. So yeah. I don't know if...
Right, so just to add, I mean, yes, you'd want people to interact with the space, have tourists and so forth, but there's still management of the space. So maybe they'll manage foot traffic, maybe they'll only allow certain number of people per day, or as Sherene mentioned, maybe not even allowed to take any fossils from any of the outcrops. So in some cases, there's a balance, that you strike a balance, and it would be obviously site specific. So whatever the sensitivities are of that specific site, then you would develop a plan around that. So yeah, to say you'd have to strike a balance. So you can still interact with the space, but you'd have to manage how people interact with that space.
I noticed that you had a quite wide range of Caribbean countries in your survey, but Barbados is missing, which I found interesting because Barbados, number one, has a branch of the university.
Yes.
Number two, has a designated national park area.
Yes.
And also has a number of other areas of significant geological interest. I was quite curious as to why Barbados is missing.
To answer your question, we send the stuff out and not
people didn't respond.
I'm so hoping you were not going to say that.
So mind you, the time frame was we had a month. Yeah, we had a month. It was a really rapid survey, and this is one of the reasons why we're trying to do this, because we want to reopen the survey so we can get additional information, but we don't want to just get the information. We want people to also begin to identify the spaces that one could consider. I mean, we don't mind once we can find funding to hop from island to island and,
when you send it out again, copy me in so I can light some fire under some backside.
Absolutely.
I'm horrified that we were not included.
Yeah, we sent it. I'm not sure what happened, but we did send it through MAC, and we can only imagine that it was shared. It's just, I don't know, I guess when you do projects like this in the summertime, maybe the people who, sometimes the hierarchy in our institutions prevent the people with the knowledge from doing the work. And so it might come to me, but I'm thinking that, okay, this should go to the dean. And so I send it to the dean, but the dean doesn't have the information. I have the information. So what you could do is fill it out and say, hey, dean, I've got this. Is this, we're participating in this. And I think our systems of government cause these little hillocks and gaps that prevent people from actually participating in something that's supposed to really be grassroots. So I think that is part of our issue. Yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
my name is Jorjan E. I'm a student here at the University of the Bahamas. And my question, as somebody who always has to write papers, is if there's any documentation of the survey that you're suggesting.
Yes, we have a website link to it. I can share the document with you if you give me your email address.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. We're gonna reopen the survey. I will inform my co-PI, Professor Van Rice, and see how we can get some additional information. Because it's time-stamped, so we can always separate the data from earlier with data now and see. Now that we've sensitized, I think we should be able to get additional information. And within each person's territory, if we're able, I spoke with Katerina last night, and one of the things we want to do is to have like a webinar and just have different people, a series of webinars, and just have different people. You can bring 1 image, 2 images, 3 images maybe, and just talk about your site. So you select a number 1 and a number 2 and a number 3, much like we have on the survey, and we just talk. And then we try to fit all of that within the context of, like how you have virtual museum, a sort of a virtual roaming, beginning sort of aspect of trying to put together what we have as geoparks. Because people are really interested in traveling for science and for nature. What we have in the Caribbean is really not nature tourism. You have somebody who walk up a mountain or walk up a side of a hill with you, but that's because you like to hike. You're not looking at the rocks. It doesn't matter to you that these same rocks are in Church X. You probably see something and you go, oh, look, what's that? And the person walking with you, he's 10 miles ahead. He couldn't care less what's that. You need to just keep up. You know what I mean? So we don't really have nature tourism necessarily. We have go to beach, walk about, shop, eat. And we have to now cater to the people who want to come and learn about us. Learn what we identify with. Learn what our stories are. Because people degrade the environment because they don't know how to treasure it, right? So just like, and I heard the president for the University of Bahamas, he said the same thing I practice. When I travel, I go to museums because I want to see what people cherish, what they hold dear. Now, you go to a country, there are no nature tours, nobody telling you about the environment, nobody taking you to a Ramsar site to be bitten by mosquitoes and smelling stinky mangroves. Nobody's doing that. So, you run your shower for your half an hour that you're gonna bathe for. You're not thinking about it. No, Bahamas doesn't have fresh water, but there's no sign in the airport that says, we don't have fresh water, conserve today, da 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 da. You don't see it in a hotel, you don't see it anywhere. So the point I'm making is that we are not engaging ourselves or our company, our visitors, in what is important to us. And limestone is important for water. And we are not making that connection for anybody. So we are hoping that, and Jorjan's master's thesis talks a lot about geoconservation and using Geo Heritage as a tool for geoconservation. And so this is the basis of why we are having this conversation. Because we need to see ourselves in our activities, we need to see ourselves in our environment. And if we're not seeing that, you can't expect anybody to see that.
Any other questions?
Right, thank you.
Amazing.